Hello, and welcome to our series of videos from the IDFC Dialogues in Goa. I have with me today James Crabtree, who is now Associate Professor of Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, and who has just written The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, which has a very elegant photograph of a pretty recognizable building in Bombay on the cover. And Bombay, of course, being where James himself lived for many years as the India correspondent for the Financial Times. James, what would people learn from this book? How does it fit into an attempt to understand India's political economy as it is structured today?
Yeah, I guess you could say that this is not a very unusual task to have another book written about India by a white British journalist.
It's never happened before.
Yeah, exactly. It's a radical new departure. I suppose in my own defense, I lived in Mumbai when most of the books that have been written by foreign correspondents about India were written in Delhi. And from the first day that I arrived, one of the things that jumps out of you is the extraordinary wealth that has been created in India, embodied more than anything by that building on the front cover of the book. And I suppose I spent my time in India wandering around, talking to industrialists, visiting factories, trying to understand what were the sources and contradictions of this wealth. And the story that I wanted to tell was partly the one that is very familiar about reopening after 1991, but particularly what happened in the mid-2000s when India really began to reopen, capital began to flood in. You had an Indian version of the Great Moderation, the moment of hyperglobalization. And the argument in the book is that three things followed from that were unusual. The first was the creation of a new cadre of hyper-wealthy individuals in India. There were only 2 billionaires in India in the mid-90s. That has now gone up to 100, 120, depending on how you count it. And India has become much more unequal over that period. In a sense, people haven't noticed this to the extent you might expect, because India was already quite unequal, and famously so. But after 1991, India, actually the elite were not that wealthy by global standards. And what you've had quietly, almost without noticing, is a much greater increase in inequality over that period.
And you call them oligarchs.
So yeah, then this is embodied by the tycoon class, the oligarchs, the people who have captured a lot of that wealth for themselves. Many of them, some of them had IT companies, but a lot of them had large conglomerates. And that brings you on to the second issue, which was corruption. So India had a long record of retail corruption, but it was really only after the liberalization period that retail corruption went wholesale. And so you had, in the mid-2000s, the beginnings of what they call the season of scams, a series of grand corruption scandals, which to some degree were brought under control by the election of Narendra Modi in 2014. But nonetheless, the issue of corruption in the Indian state is a big problem. And then you have a third issue, which is rooted in India's industrial model, namely that you had a boom in infrastructure investment led by the oligarchs, who made an awful lot of money contributing to their wealth. And then that system entirely collapsed in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So you had large companies taking on too much debt and banks that had lent too much with a bad debt problem. Now, the big argument in the book is that India is trying to follow a path that other countries have gone on before, from poverty to lower middle income status, through middle income to being rich. It's quite difficult to imagine India making that journey until it has fixed these three problems. If you look at the countries that have made that journey, they tend to be relatively equal compared to India. They tend to have poor people who have basic services and rich people who pay their taxes, and that's not true in India. They tend to not be outrageously corrupt. And they tend to be able to build infrastructure and sort of develop their states in a way that India is struggling to do. Now, that is not to say that India has a unique problem. I think there's plenty of examples in history of countries that have gone through this period that you might call a gilded age. It certainly happened in Britain and America, Korea, Japan, China to some degree is emerging from that now. So I think there's much to be optimistic about in India's future, but it has to fix these three problems if it's to have any hope of sort of becoming a rich country by the middle of this century.
So I'm going to push back on a couple of things that you said there. One was the assumption essentially that the building of infrastructure will require me to first deal with these oligarchs who have monopolized the space and in some sense are now in trouble. But surely, for example, the Gilded Age metaphor suggests that that may not be exactly accurate, because the railway tycoons, for example, who were a great feature of the Gilded Age in the 1880s and 1890s in America, had already built that infrastructure. In the process, it was in some sense the corrupt who had in fact built the infrastructure. I would make the same argument about China over the past 15 years. I mean, obviously, because it's not in open society, they haven't had the same major headlines about corruption scandals, but it is generally understood that there was a nexus between local party leaders and infrastructure building that led to their enrichment. But again, as a byproduct of this corruption, or maybe corruption was a byproduct of infrastructure building, or infrastructure building may have been a byproduct of corruption. So maybe it's, if we go after cleaning up the oligarchs, and if we go focus laser-like on corruption, which is the tendency in a democracy, we'll find it harder to build infrastructure than otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of conundrum from economic development. That is corruption good or bad? Can you grease the wheels? And India finds itself in a very peculiar situation. So between, let's say, the beginning of the 2000s and when the corruption scandals began to come to light in 2009-10, India had its most successful infrastructure building period probably in its entire history. It was also the moment where it was probably at its most corrupt. And so corruption and good building of infrastructure to some degree goes hand in hand. This certainly happened in China as well, although that was mostly done by state companies. And so there is a case now, I think, in India. You could make the case that India needs a bit more corruption under Modi, and that would help.
Nobody would dare make this case.
That would grease the wheels. But the problem is, India is a democracy, and so we've now reached a point where the institutions that found out about the grand corruption that happened at the end of the last decade remain vigilant. So you have a very active press, you have a judiciary, you have government auditors. You, in a sense, the option that India may have had of using what you would call strategic rent seeking. So if you look at the example of Malaysia or Thailand, these development economies, they use rent seeking strategically. Their leaders would say, okay, you can be corrupt as long as you build the kind of things that we think you need to build. So you can have rents if you build export-focused manufacturing that will help us develop. India doesn't really have that option, I don't think, because its democratic institutions would simply not allow it. It would create a public scandal. And so it doesn't have the option, I think, now of corruption plus infrastructure. It has to take another route, and that other route has to be, the gradual building of a more functional, but broadly speaking, less corrupt state, because the option of sort of larceny but good infrastructure is not really available to it.
But that would take a lot longer, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that's the bind that India is now in. It doesn't really have the option of the kind of good crony capitalism that you had in South Korea for a while, or Malaysia under Mahathir, where you had plenty of corruption, but very rapid infrastructure-led development. It's going to have to do it differently. Or what's going to happen, and I fear this may actually be what will happen, certainly it is the risk, that when they finally clean up the banks and the conglomerates get the debt off their books, there will be such a pent-up demand for new infrastructure that has not been being built that we're just going to go through the whole cycle again. That is the real risk that India faces, that you've had one gigantic cycle of boom and bust in which we built a lot of infrastructure and we're only really kind of beginning to dig ourselves out of it now. Then the risk, and you've effectively had a lost decade of infrastructure investment in India as a consequence of that. And the risk is that in about 2 or 3 years' time, you then have another moment of gangbusters development in which all of the tycoons rediscover their animal spirits, and then it all falls over again, and that would be a disaster. So in a sense, a more gradual, slightly less corrupt path would be better than that. We would all like to have everything. We would like to have no corruption and very rapid infrastructure development, but we probably can't have that. So you have to pick from your less good options.
So, to return to this notion of the oligarchs who we look to for this kind of development, and the ones who will survive this winnowing process and then hopefully help build infrastructure again in the future. In some sense, in the 2000s, they were heroes. And the combination of the global crisis, India's slowdown, the season of scams has turned a lot of people who were heroes in that period into hate figures now. And where does the sort of, do you engage with, in this book, the cultural position in our lives of these men, mostly men, and how it has changed for them?
I mean, I have some sympathy for the tycoons, actually. If you look back to the subtitle of the book is India's New Gilded Age. And so there is this slightly ropey analogy between the American Gilded Age after the Civil War in the late 19th century and what's going on in India now. Now, it breaks down pretty quickly as soon as you start putting any weight on it, but there are analogies. So this was, in America, a period of rapid infrastructure development, urbanization, the beginnings of the development of a middle class. You had rampantly corrupt urban politics, a lot of things that are also true in contemporary India. And there's been a bit of a change in the way that historians tend to view the tycoons of that period. At the time, as in India now, they were viewed basically as kind of unscrupulous villains. Latterly, we tend to view them more as heroes of capitalism, risk takers, people who were able to make moves that other people were not able to make. At the moment in India, it's quite difficult to view most of the oligarchs in this way, but actually, you know, they do work within this system. They are able to make things happen. They are able to make investments. The problem that India has, in an odd way, is that the tycoons, with a few notable exceptions, like Mukesh Ambani, the head of Reliance Industries, whose house is on the front of my book, who actually still is investing enormous amounts of money, many of the rest of them are becalmed, because of the problems that happened after the end of the last decade. They're actually not doing very much. Their balance sheets are ruined. They're not getting money from the banks. And this is the problem that India faces, that it had an investment model which sort of worked for a while until it fell over, which was based around large industrial conglomerates, family-owned businesses, and risk-taking tycoons. At the moment, that model certainly isn't working because the industrial conglomerates have too much debt, the banks aren't going to lend any money to them, and the tycoons have kind of lost their confidence. The old model is broken, but India is yet to develop a new model, and that is the challenge. And it's a challenge that Narendra Modi, as the Prime Minister, has not really managed to fix, which is India is now a lower middle-income country. Can it develop an industrial investment model that is more suitable for the path to middle-income status than early industrial development?
Well, that's, in some sense, that brings me to my next question, which is, do you see a reckoning again with the events of the age of scams, a change in how maybe the public perception, in the public perception in India of that period, and to what extent do you feel that you're essentially writing a history of the rise and current stagnation or fall of many of these oligarchs? To what degree do you feel this book is contributing to a re-evaluation of their position in India's economic life?
Well, I suppose, I don't have the view that these guys are particularly good or particularly bad. What I was trying to do is understand the position that they themselves found themselves to be in. What would India's tycoons say about themselves? And what was curious about it was, so I spent time with some of these people to the extent that they would let me, and they, their vision of themselves was victims. It's curious. So if you speak to Vijay Mallya, who's one of the figures, the head of Kingfisher Airlines, now bankrupt, who's in exile in London, or Naveen Jindal, who's another character in the book, who was a buccaneering tycoon, very aggressive, very flamboyant polo player. Both of them see themselves as, in a sense, victims of, to some degree, misfortune, and some degree victims of the state. That they were trying to do good things. They were trying to build businesses, make moves in ways that other people were not able to do. They were working within the system as they found it. So the system wasn't perfect, but they were working within it and doing good things. They were building airlines, they were building large iron smelters and steel plants in very unlikely parts of the country. And, they came unstuck, but it wasn't their fault. And so I suppose I was almost more interested in anything else in the psychology of tycoonery. If you are one of these remarkable people, again, look at the building on the front of the book, what sort of person decides to build a house that, it doesn't really cost $1 billion, but that's what it's called, the $1 billion house. What is the psychology of people who want to build that as their home and then also decide to personally deploy billions and billions of dollars building these grand infrastructure projects? And I suppose my sense is if these figures are so central to the operation of your economy, then you ought to understand, in a sense, how they view themselves. And so I'm not trying to reevaluate, sort of oligarchs or tycoons per se. I wanted to understand how they see themselves.
So to take the sort of Gilded Age metaphor a little further, two things emerged out of that period, for America in particular. And the first was that a lot of the men who were the robber barons of the period, whether it was Andrew Carnegie, who had a terrible record with labor, or Mellon, who was again not a very pleasant and popular person of the time, or even the Rockefellers. 100 years on, U.S. Steel may have shut down, or may not exist in any real sense. But the philanthropy and the institutions that they built in the non-profit sector continue to exist. We don't really see much of that in India. It's a sort of an interesting difference between these two sets of robber barons. And I was wondering whether there's something in their psychology that could account for this.
I'm not sure that's quite right. I think maybe we retrospectively look at the legacies of some of these tycoons 100 years later when they endowed enormous foundations that still exist today. But at the time, they weren't viewed as great, philanthropists. In fact, they only did that latterly because they had such rotten reputation. So the figure who I look at very briefly in the book. As I say, I don't talk a huge amount about the Gilded Age. I'm using this metaphor lightly, but Cornelius Vanderbilt is the figure who reminds me most of some of the Indian tycoons, who was the kind of first generation. He had a terrible reputation. He was the richest man in America. He was seen as this loutish, kind of rude figure. And to the extent that these guys did become philanthropists, they didn't do it because they believed in the public good. They wanted to rehabilitate their own image. Actually, India has a relatively good reputation for corporate philanthropy, in part because its state provision is so bad. So it's not clear to me that India has a particularly poor reputation in that regard. I think the task is much more, in the end, India only, the US and the UK and other countries moved through this period because of the development of the state. Both the type of money that had to be extracted from business, but to some degree the clientelism that you saw in politics was only really conquered when you had the development of a more impartial, well-funded state apparatus. And that is clearly one of the big challenges that India faces, that in all sorts of areas, in basic health and education, in training, in skills, the Indian state is incapable, and or only partially capable, and until more progress is made in that regard, then it's quite difficult to see how you break out of this kind of Gilded Age feel. And that, again, is an area where those of us who comment on Indian politics talk a lot about reforms and whether the government is introducing structural reforms, which is an area where you can debate this one way or another. But Narendra Modi, as Prime Minister, since he arrived in 2014, he has reduced the level of grand corruption, I think it would be fair to say. But whether he has improved the capacity of India's state, I think is a much more open question.
Thank you, James. I think we'll leave it there. It's sort of a very important thought that on the one hand, you have this sort of inequality, the natural oligarchy that comes with development. But on the other hand, there are the softer, within quotes, sides of what a development state should be doing, which is building social infrastructure in some sense, one will help fix the other. And I think that's an interesting place to leave it. Thank you.
Good.